So welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Annie Pomsa. I'm an assistant professor of the practice here in the Teaching, Curriculum, and Society Department. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Alyssa Hadley Dunn and welcome her back to Boston College, where she completed her undergraduate degree right here at the Lynch School in Secondary Education and English. Before we get started, I just wanted to also thank the Undoing Oppression Committee and the TCS department for co-sponsoring this event. I would like to welcome my class of future elementary school teachers who are sort of scattered here in the front, so who have read Dr. Dunn's recent work. So they're very excited to have you here. I also wanted to thank Marcia Burnett in 211, who helps us organize everything, as well as our marketing team. And the tech team, who's here because so many people wanted to come today, but they're still in schools. So we'll be able to record the event and have it for them later. So, what do teachers do in their classrooms the day after a tragic or traumatic event? How can they attend to their students' needs while teaching for equity and justice? Many of us have asked these same questions of ourselves here teaching at Boston College. Dr. Alyssa Hadley Dunn, Director of Teacher Education and Associate Professor of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Connecticut's NEAG School of Education, has made these questions a focus of her work as a teacher and a scholar. She has published widely and is also a committed public scholar, contributing to the Huffington Post and National Public Radio. Among other awards, Dr. Dunn is the winner of the Critical Educators for Social Justice Revolutionary Mentor Award from AERA and Michigan State University's Teacher Scholar of the Year Award. Dr. Dunn is also the founder of a Facebook group, Teaching on Days After, with almost 20,000 members, who are teachers and other school personnel. In her book, Teaching on Days After, Educating for Equity in the Wake of Injustice, Dr. Dunn examines examples of days after that teachers remember, including 9/11, elections, natural disasters, gun violence, police brutality, social uprisings, Supreme Court decisions, immigration policies, and more. She also shares examples of days after that K-12 and college-age students remember, including what their teachers did and didn't do, and how they experienced those moments. Dr. Dunn's talk today will highlight equity and justice-focused pedagogical approaches that can be used to support current classroom teachers and to help pre-service teachers think ahead to their future classrooms. She will provide useful and thought-provoking guidance for teachers and educational personnel in a variety of educational contexts at all levels who navigate these very difficult and all too frequent days after. Thanks, Dr. Dunn.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. How are you today?
Good.
Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Good. All right. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today. I'm grateful that you have the time and space and energy to be here. I'm especially grateful to Dr. Hamza for organizing this visit. And as she said, this feels like a homecoming to me because I got my undergraduate degree here in secondary education and English. And so I thought I'd start by showing you the last time I was at BC. This was actually my first day at BC, moving into my dorm on Newton. Anyone? All right, okay, Mrs. Hardy, I bet it still looks the same. You can see the historical artifact of the Dirty Dancing poster. And that was the last time I was here at the BC graduation. So it was here that I first learned what it really means to be an educator. It was here that I learned what it means to teach for social justice, to be a change agent in schools and communities, and to be a scholar activist. So much of what I share with you today is really based on the person and the teacher that I became in Campion Hall. So here's what we're going to talk about today, and I hope that this is just the start of cultivating some ideas for you. This is the start of a conversation. And you will also have opportunities for participating throughout. All of the things that I share today are in the book that Dr. Hamza mentioned, based on interviewing teachers and students in PK to 12 schools and universities around the US. I wanted to share with you that the proceeds from the book are going to two amazing nonprofit organizations called the Abolitionist Teaching Network and Woke Kindergarten. Have you heard of those? If you haven't, write them down. They're amazing. They're just as cool as they sound. Now, because we're talking about teaching on days after, of course, we have to start this conversation with remembering that we are in the midst of another days after right now. Just 1 week after yet another mass school shooting, this time in Nashville, Tennessee. So I talk about this work a lot, even before the book came out. And every time I talk about it, I have to switch the photos on this slide. I've never not given this talk on the day after or days after someone was murdered. And every time I talk about it, there's a new photo or photos to include, new names and lives to honor. So I want us to take a minute to think about the families and communities that are still hurting in the wake of this most recent senseless tragedy and of those who were lost. And knowing how every school shooting reverberates around the country to other schools and campuses, I invite you to participate today as much as you feel moved, knowing that there are many other things on your hearts and minds in this moment in our world. Because if you think about it, every day is a day after for someone related to something. It just depends on how you, and more importantly your students, define an event as major enough to address. What that also means is that tomorrow is a day after. So I'm going to do a teacher thing. Can anyone read this for us? Who would like to read? Excellent, thank you. What's your name?
Natalie.
Natalie, thank you so much.
Let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. To any citizen of this country who figures himself as responsible, and particularly those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people, must be prepared to go for broke. Or, to put it in another way, we must understand that in the attempt to correct so many generations of bad faith and cruelty, when it is operating not only in the classroom but in society, you will meet the most fantastic, the most brutal, and the most determined resistance. There is no point in pretending that this won't happen.
Thank you, Natalie. All right, yes, thank you, thank you. the pre-service teachers know what to do. Okay. Does anyone know who said this? Some of the faculty in the room might even teach this. Anyone know?
Baldwin?
Yes, where did that come from?
James Baldwin?
Yes, James Baldwin, yes. Author, scholar, activist. James Baldwin said this in a speech called A Talk to Teachers in 1963. But this could be written about our socio-political teaching context today, right? So as in most things, Baldwin is as prescient as ever. We are often asked, where were you when, right? The day of something. When I think of days of, I think of BC, because my first day at BC was September 11th. And my first day after was September 12th, sitting in a poetry class. So I want you to also think about where you were on days after. When I ask people where they were on days after, powerful memories are often evoked. You might remember where you were sitting in the classroom, who your classmates were, who your teacher was. So what I'd like you to do is see if you can activate those memories now. In pairs or groups of 3, I'd like for you to talk with each other briefly about days after that you remember at the international, national, state, local, or school level. This can be from when you were a student yourself, when you were a faculty member or a staff role or as an administrator. So it'll take about 5 minutes for you to remember where you were, and what your teachers did or didn't do. Okay? So we'll take about 5 minutes to chat and then come back together as a group.
I found out when
Okay, let's come back together. All right, we'll come back together now. Thank you so much. So would anyone like to share what you and your partner or partners talked about? What are some things that you remember? I also learned about wait time in this room, so I will wait you out. Yes, okay.
We talked about the marathon bombing, so I was on a school trip when it happened, and like I just was saying like I'll never forget the look on like the teacher's face when she got the call, and like we were just like coming from a fun event, and then she had to like tell us all it was horrible.
How old were you? Do you remember?
It was
What
like
grade?
12, I think.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. As I was walking around, I think I heard others talking about that as well, that that was something that stands out to you. So do you know what happened the next day? Did you go to school?
No, like we were away. We were in Canada when it happened.
Oh,
on
a
school
far
trip. Yeah, so, like,
trip.
none of us
Okay.
were with our families.
Okay, not like Plymouth Rock. kind of.
No,
Okay.
we were like away. And so like no one really knew if everyone was okay.
Oh,
Like it was just
wow.
like really scary, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Others, yes.
I was talking about the Sandy Hook shooting. So I mean, I like remember like vividly that day. Like I was like with my mom, my papa, my older sister, and just like watching the news. Like the mom was crying. It was just like very emotional. But I don't remember what happened the day after school. Like I don't really remember them bringing it up to us, or if they did, like it wasn't anything like they talked about a lot where I was.
So what you remember is the day of, but not the day after.
Yeah.
Nothing special happened that made it stand out to you.
No.
And how old would you have been? 5 or 6?
No, I was older than that. I was like in elementary school or like
Okay.
middle school. Like, in
Gotcha.
between that.
Oh, okay. All right.
I remember the day after Sandy Hook. I was thinking 11 something around there, and I remember I was saying I went to a play date after school. We did not talk about it at school, but I went like to a friend's house, and we were talking about it, and we were told to stop talking about it because she had younger siblings, and I like will never forget being told to stop talking about it, and I remember like itching to go home and talk to my family about it, and like talk to people that finally wanted to talk about it, and that was like my first introduction to like something like that and talking about it and when to not talk about it and how young is too young to talk about it.
Yeah, thank you. Other things, yes.
I was talking a little bit about the school shooting in Uvalde. I'm from Texas and we actually live like an hour away from Uvalde, so when it happened I was back home for the summer and my mom is like a teacher, so I remember like the first thing that I thought about was like my mom and just like being super nervous about it, and I remember talking to her and being like, oh my gosh, like she got home from work and being like, oh my gosh mom, like did you see that this happened, like all of these things, and my mom just kind of talking about like, well, I still have to go to work, like we still have to do things, and I remember like the next day that she went back to work just being like so anxious about her still having to show up to work and not being able to really like change the fact that there's still children who have to go to school, and like she works at a Head Start, so she works with like little children who don't even talk yet, but it's still like such a like anxious moment, I think, like not just for like my mom who's a teacher, but also like all of her kids at home like waiting for her, obviously.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's really hard. Wow, thank you for sharing that with us. Any last one that you'd like to share? Does anyone in the room remember being a teacher on a day after? Would anyone like to share? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was teaching 4th through 6th grade during like 2019 to 2021, so there were a lot of days after, and I think I kind of remember the night before the day after the most of like trying to grapple with how to plan for the day after. And then I think what I remember about those days after are more the emotions than like the actual instructional activities, right, or minutia of conversations, but just remember, like, after Trump was elected, we, my principal went around and talked to each classroom, and I just remember, like, everyone being incredibly emotional and trying to be in community together, because I taught in Roxbury, so the students that I was working with were particularly affected.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah.
Like, as soon as she was saying this, I thought about like the everyday experiences, right? Like a lot of our students, you know, where I teach, they come from communities where like gun violence is very, very prevalent, and it's kind of crazy because, you know, death does happen, right? Like just the other day, a kid got shot near what's it called, around Dorchester. And it's like we never really stop and talk about that. Only when it's something that's like on a mass scale or on a higher level that everybody knows about. So it's like, it's kind of crazy to think about that they deal with that. We see that every day, but we never talk about it.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So I appreciate all of what you remembered, and maybe some things that you didn't remember, right? That what you might remember is silence from your teachers, even if you wanted to talk about something. What I've come to realize is that on days after movements toward justice, and somehow equally so on days after tragedies and traumas, there's actually nowhere that I would rather be than with my students. And we need to push back against the culture of silence in our schools and our universities, so that our own students' days after memories are not the same as so many long-grown adults' memories of missed opportunities and silence, but are instead moments of human connection and justice. So I wanted to share with you some teacher and some student perspectives from the research that I did. Again, this is with teachers, K-12, all content areas, all demographics across the United States. And we're going to read some words from teachers and students. So I am going to ask for some volunteers. Can I have 3 volunteers to read teachers' words? You can just put your hand up. Okay, you're going to be teacher 1, thank you. Teacher 2, teacher 3. Yes, okay, thank you. And then we are going to have some students. Actually, I'll do the students because those are pretty short. Okay, so here we go. Teacher 1.
I wanted to do something about Kavanaugh and the hearings. God, I wanted it so bad. But I was just afraid of what parents would say if they found out, let alone if my principal did. I really, hold on. I think I might be outside my door. Okay, it's fine. It's not them. I'm scared to talk about talking about. How silly is that? Right?
Teacher 2.
Teaching after the 2016 election was like no other day I'd ever experienced. It was the toughest day of my career. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to do something. My students were directly impacted as I teach mainly students from other countries and a lot of Muslim students. I was desperate for help figuring out what to teach and how, but all I got was silence.
And teacher 3.
I'm teaching in Chicago now, so I wanted to do something related to the trial of the police officer who killed Laquan McDonald, but I didn't know what I should do or like when. I needed time to figure things out, so I'm planning an entire unit on it next semester. But is that too late? There are going to be other children and other people killed before then, unfortunately. We know that it will happen, so how do I talk about them too and honor them?
Thank you. And now some students. This is a 6th grade student on January 7th talking about the January 6th insurrection. Of course we knew what was going on. Teachers and the principal just pretended we didn't. The next is an undergraduate student of color on the day after the 2016 presidential election. I just wanted them to see me, to know I was afraid and to acknowledge it, but it was just silent. Next is a 9th grader on the day after a local incident of police brutality and racial violence. Our teachers constantly tell us to get off social media like it's a bad thing, but it's also the only place people are honest with kids. Like, why should I have to find out about another racist police thing on TikTok when I'm sitting there with teachers who could help us talk through it and work through it? But instead, we're all like alone in our bedrooms or in the hallways, trying to figure it out. And the next one is from an undergraduate student of color at a predominantly white institution on the day after white supremacist flyers were put up on campus. It was so much worse because the administration didn't say anything. I found out about it on Instagram. And last is a 10th grade student. My teachers are obviously trying to protect themselves. They think we don't know what they mean when they say they aren't supposed to talk about it. But we know exactly what they mean. They mean they're protecting themselves instead of us, even when kids our age are literally dying. So those quotations were not hand-picked. Well, they were hand-picked. They were not cherry-picked to get you to think a certain thing. This is very representative of what teachers and students are saying. So I'd like you to think back to the teacher quotations and the student quotes and do another teacher thing. What do you notice and what do you wonder? So I'm going to ask you to talk again with a partner or partners about any themes or ideas that come up for you when you're thinking of teachers and students' words. And we'll take about 5 minutes for that.
Like I feel like when you have what if the teachers were waiting just for
Okay, one more minute. One more minute. Okay, let's come back together. Thank you. I'm sorry that I have to keep interrupting your engaged and robust conversations, but would anyone be willing to share what you noticed and what you wondered? Yes, thank you.
We were talking a little bit about how it seems that a lot of the teachers want to do something, but they just don't feel equipped or don't feel supported within their district or school system to be able to do so. And some of them are worried about maybe losing their jobs. Some of them are worried about saying the wrong thing, upsetting parents, and just feeling like they might make a mistake or something. But then on the students' end, it's clear that they want to talk about these things because they're seeing them everywhere. Most kids have TikTok. I was talking about my little cousin who is on TikTok, and he's in middle school, and he's seeing these things all the time. He literally is nonstop on TikTok, and he talks about the most random things. I'm like, how do you know that? But it's I don't know. They just know everything. So it needs to be.
Thank you, thank you. So there's this gap between maybe what we see teachers wanting to do and what they feel able to do, the gap between the desire and their perceived skills, right? Yeah.
I feel like there's this gap between how teachers perceive silence and doing nothing versus how students perceive it. And I feel like from those statements from the teachers, I feel like very often teachers will get stuck in this trap of perfectionism where it's if I can't have this conversation perfectly and talk about this issue perfectly, I shouldn't speak about it at all. And I think that what those statements show us is that even just telling your kids I know that this thing happened, I honestly am not as informed about it as I should be, but I just want to acknowledge it. I think there's this idea that doing nothing is better than doing it wrong,
yes.
When actually the mentality should be doing something is always going to be better than doing nothing, as long as you have the right intentions.
Thank you. Yeah, very thoughtful. Thank you. Others? Yes.
So one wonder we had was about leaders, school leaders, principals, etc. and whether or not they had conversations the day after with students, with teachers, what kind of sort of environment and support they provided either prior to or after in order to encourage, on this conversation.
Yes, thank you. And then we heard the quotation from the educator in Michigan, right, who I was talking to in her classroom. And I tried to represent all of the emotions that she was going through, right? And you did an amazing job embodying that. Because there was a lot happening, right? You saw her emotions on this really broad spectrum, and then her really reflective questioning of, is that really silly? Maybe it's not really silly that I'm worried about them listening at the door. Any other wonders or noticings? Yes, thank you.
We talked about that we would notice was fear. Now what we wondered is what could we replace fear with? We replaced it with transparency, and we're echoing the idea that we can say, I'm just acknowledging that this happened and I don't know what to do about it. And then how could we support our educators from the top down to be empowered to be able to see that?
Thank you. Yes, lots of fear. And so, to be clear, the teachers who were talking in these quotations, their stories are not the ones in the book. That doesn't mean that they are not important, that their stories are not important. But what I wanted to highlight was teachers who had that fear, who might have felt disempowered, whose leaders might not have had those conversations, and they did it anyway. And how did they do it? How did they make that choice to do something? And then what did that choice look like in action? Because I think we, especially with the way that teaching is talked about in public discourse, in the media, the anti-learning laws that we see happening all around the country right now, rightfully so in some cases, instills fear in future and current educators. And so the teacher stories in this work are ones who might feel that fear, but who take a different route than staying silent. So I want to share a little bit then about what they did and how they did it. What do you do on these days when you don't know what to do? How do we know what the quote-unquote right thing to do is? How do we consider our own positionality as we make these decisions? And the reason that I started this project is because first, two colleagues and I first started researching the day after the 2016 election, exploring how teachers responded in the days and weeks after Trump was elected. And so these two colleagues and I are we are all qualitative researchers. So, normally we talk to like 4 or 6 people. But we developed this questionnaire that we put out the day after the election, and over 1,000 teachers from around the country responded. So we were like, oh, what do we do now? That's a lot. That's a lot of data. What do we do? But what it really showed us was that teachers needed to talk about what happened because they didn't feel prepared for that day. And they knew that their students needed something, they just weren't sure how to do it. So in talking with teachers across 3 years, what I argue about Days After Pedagogy is that it's not just a time when you teach, but it's a way that you teach. Teaching on Days After is not a, quote, neutral endeavor, especially in the days after elections, racial violence, other socio-political upheaval. Days After Pedagogy is one that demands a commitment to equity and action. As Paulo Freire writes, washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. Because honestly, we know that the idea of curricular neutrality is a myth, right? There's nothing neutral about what is taught or how it is taught. And is neutrality ever possible? Who does neutrality protect? So though we hear these quotations from teachers who might be attempting to be neutral or apolitical, Actually, remaining neutral is a political choice. As scholar Tyrone Howard has argued, where issues of racism and inequity are concerned, neutrality, silence, and inaction all serve as ringing endorsements for racial oppression and inequity. So what does that look like in practice? This is funny because whenever I do this talk, I read a line that's in the book, but it's usually not at the place where I learned this thing. So I always say, one of the very first lessons that I learned in an undergraduate education course, and the person who taught me that is here, Dr. Albert. She said in that class, we teach children, not content. Children come first, content comes second. So if we align our pedagogy with this now truism for many educators, then how can we not teach for justice and equity on days after? Even in higher education, for the faculty in the room, we might not be teaching children, but we are still teaching humans. We are teaching someone's child. So if we care about people, we care about what's happening in their lives and in the world around them. If we care about people, we can put aside our planned lessons for a day or more to address the most critical issues of our time. And if we care about people, we know that ignoring the issues does more harm than good. Because even if it protects teachers in the moment, it risks students and teachers' own humanity. So this is what teachers said were key components of teaching on days after. And that if you did those things, they were then both the reasons that you engaged in days after discussions and the outcomes. The purposes and the outcomes were the same if you enacted these things. So again, teaching on days after is a pedagogy in pursuit of justice and equity. It's something that I argue teachers can and must do if they want to support all children, especially our most vulnerable at this particular socio-political time point. But it's also a pedagogy that can't exist in isolation. Teaching on days after only works if you've been teaching for justice on days before and days during. In many ways, what teachers articulated about days after pedagogy is similar to existing frameworks of strong teaching, like culturally relevant or sustaining pedagogy, teaching for social justice, abolitionist teaching. But what makes it unique is the confluence of the need for these student-centered and humanizing pedagogical skills with the immediacy and the uncertainty of these days. It requires a willingness to take risks and change your curriculum at the last minute, like you were saying, the night before, right? It requires teachers to be constant and critical consumers of the news and advocates for critical literacies in students' consumption of the news. And it also requires teachers to be vulnerable about our own emotions, confusions, and struggles with often controversial and sensitive topics. This often happens as new information is still emerging. So we think about the elections, we think about insurrection, I'm gonna pluralize it, let's hope not. That teachers have to figure out what's happening at the same time that they're trying to help students figure out what's happening. Teachers themselves may not know how to feel, let alone how to help students. So I do believe that all teaching contexts are different and that some contextual factors may seem to limit or promote certain types of days after pedagogy. I also know from talking with teachers that there are some overlapping pedagogical moves and stances that all teachers can take in these critical moments. The other thing that teachers shared is that teaching on days after is not just sustaining for students, but also for teachers, because it allows us as educators to execute a vision of teaching that's more closely aligned to our imagined teaching self. So instead of being people who are guided by neoliberal policies of testing, of standardization, of guidelines and benchmarks and scripted curriculum, we can be the teachers that the students need in that moment. So in the refusal to be silent in the face of injustice, in the refusal to claim neutrality, teachers open the possibility of teaching towards transformation. So what that means, though, is that there's no checklist for days after pedagogy. That means that it will look different depending on the structure of a class. It could be discussions in small groups. It could be acknowledging what happened and saying that you need to get more information. It could be emailing students to let them know that they can talk with you individually. It could be whole class discussion and a sharing of resources. There's no exact thing to do, even though we know that sometimes teachers are looking for that. But what we do know is that we can prepare for future days after. Unfortunately, the one thing we know for sure about days after is that they will continue to happen. We don't know when, and we don't know what the event or the moment will be, but we know that something can happen, and so we can proactively prepare for this. I'm going to share very briefly some strategies now. So the first is that when we're thinking about days after pedagogy, to consider our own positionality. And when I say positionality, I mean all of the different identity markers that we embody. Race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, language, ability, religion. So, for example, if you identify as white, as cisgender, or as a man, or in any other dominant identity category, we cannot rely on our colleagues who occupy more marginalized identities to be the only ones teaching about these issues and moments as they happen if they impact those communities and groups. So, a specific example, it should not and cannot be only Black teachers who address the ongoing instances of racial violence and white supremacy. As white people, and I include myself in that, we can't pretend to be surprised anymore. So we don't know when these instances will happen, but we know they will, and we need to be proactive about standing up and exhibiting allyship and accomplishment and co-conspiratorship in those moments. One way to make sure that you can have days after discussions is to ensure that you have classroom dialogue norms created as a collective. So this is an example of something that I share with my students at the beginning of every semester. They can come up with expectations for themselves, for their peers, and for me as an instructor. So for example, one that they always come up with and that we talk about as a group is that intent does not mitigate impact. Doesn't matter what you intend to do or say, if the impact is harmful, you've still caused harm. I've worked with teachers to adapt this for kindergarten through high school because we know that kids are capable of a whole lot more than we give them credit for, right? Anybody who's ever been in an early childhood classroom knows that kids can and do this and often do it very beautifully, more than adults, right? So I've also been recently including this quotation from the outstanding Tyree Jones in response to the constant public refrain that we should be teaching two sides or both sides. And she says, for example, the middle is a point equidistant from two poles. That's it. There's nothing inherently virtuous about being neither here nor there. Then to the end, what is halfway between moral and immoral? Finally, I have my students read a great article by Aslam Sensoy and Robin DiAngelo from their book, Is Everyone Really Equal? It's an article called How to Engage in Classes with Social Justice Content. And these are some of the recommendations that they offer directly to students. When I give these to students, I ask them to rank them in order a few different ways as an act of self-reflection. So for example, put them in the order of the ones that you have the most practice doing, or the ones that you're most worried about doing. Find the one that bothers you the most when other people don't do it. Find the one that bothers you the most when you catch yourself not doing it. And when we start the semester or start the year with these, then we can return to them on days after. Again, these are great to adapt for any grade level and content area. But as much as I like these recommendations, they're also limited. Sensoy and D'Angelo's recommendations are written through what Toni Morrison calls the white gaze. So that's why it says down here, not all of these apply to all people in the same way. So after my students read it, I always add these additional norms to Sensoy and D'Angelo, offered as a way to remind students that it is not up to those from marginalized groups, for example, to be, quote, nice, civil, or calm in the face of dehumanization, to educate others about their experiences, to speak for their particular marginalized group, to make others feel comfortable. And when we expect those individuals to do so, that engages in further oppression and dehumanization. Some other strategies that teachers talked about a lot about being prepared for days after was collaborating. So collaborating with colleagues and identifying these folks ahead of time. Who do you know who already does this, who already tries to teach for equity and justice on days after? Who can you be in dialogue with about what you're doing and how you're doing it? How can you share resources and lesson ideas? And that's especially important for the teachers who in the work were what I call ideological outsiders, where they felt like everyone else in the school was, for example, a Trump voter and they had voted for Clinton, where they were a teacher of color in a predominantly white school, where they had no supportive leadership. So you have a great community here, right? You can hopefully continue to support each other in this work. It's also important to get support from administrators, from program coordinators, from chairs, directors, or deans who can issue statements or reminders that it is important to not be neutral and not be silent in the face of ongoing injustice. A lot of times when I talk about this, I get questions about pushback. And what do I do if this thing happens? And so you can prepare ahead of time for a variety of responses. Focus on, quote, facts and not opinions. So some might say, when you're talking about these things, about equity and justice, that it's your opinion that you're discussing. So what I tell my students is actually, yes, it is my opinion. But it is my opinion because I have read and learned over the years from decades of evidence that fill in the blank. And that can model for them that their opinions too can and should be based on evidence. Remember too that our schools' learning goals and policies and missions and visions can support this. So in particular, a lot of K-12 districts have goals about, quote, diversity, about citizenship, about college and career readiness, right? You have to have discussions in college. You have to have discussions in your career. You have to be willing to take a stand. So the things that I and the teachers in the book are arguing for are not outside the realm of what is already part of the curriculum. I also encourage students to practice what they say because they're a little bit afraid, to your point, of saying the wrong thing, right? So we can practice what we say and how we'll say it because we have nothing to defend when we teach about these moments. We don't have to ask for either permission or forgiveness. We are not indoctrinating students. We are not politicking. We are teaching for justice and equity. We are not teaching to be partisan. We are teaching for human rights. So when we respond to students, we can practice doing so in a straightforward manner. That might be by learning mindful communication practices or interrupter phrases. Mindful communication practices are these common communication moves that you can make to make it clear to students that you can't tolerate what they're saying or that you need them to expand more so that you can respond appropriately. So mindful communication strategies are long sentence prompts and habits of communication. They are also things that you might learn in therapy about how to have difficult conversations with people in your life. So there are things like, can you tell me more about what you mean by? Or, I think I heard you say, right? So it's using I instead of you statements. And then finally, there's these interrupter phrases that are shorter responses that stop the harmful or questionable comments in a different way. They stop them from becoming more harmful immediately. Here are some examples. So, for teachers who are worried about how the discussion will go in their class on days after, because, for example, they have students from a wide variety of identity categories, a wide variety of political affiliations, they may start with the longer mindful communication strategies for the discussion, or they may need these, right? Or, to be clear, you may not want to go that route at all. I'm not personally a fan of the safe space language when it comes to classroom community. First, because we can never guarantee a completely safe space in our classrooms, because we don't know what students are going to say to and about each other and about each other's communities and contexts. And even if I could guarantee what happens in my small classroom space, we are working in, as Bell Hooks says, an imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist, cis heteropatriarchy. We are existing on stolen land right now. So I can absolutely do my best to ensure, for example, that no one makes explicit racist, homophobic, sexist, transphobic, xenophobic, or otherwise discriminatory statements. But truly the most I can do is what scholars like Subini Anama call harm reduction. Address it when it happens and be swift and decisive and clear in how I do so. We may not be able to do no harm in these moments, but we can learn how to do less harm. And further, I don't actually think the classroom should be safe for all viewpoints. I'm not going to debate another person's right to exist. I am not going to debate another person's humanity. So these phrases and strategies can support harm reduction, even in the absence of a completely quote-unquote safe space. So the last thing I wanted to share before we hopefully have some time, yes, time for questions, is about this Facebook group that Dr. Hamza mentioned. So I know that when I say Facebook group, it makes me sound very old. I acknowledge that. Let me tell you why, okay? When I first started this project with 30 initial teachers before it grew to 100 that I interviewed for the book, many of those teachers felt like what I mentioned earlier, like ideological outsiders. Like they had no one to talk to the night before something happened, or right after something happened the night before they had to go back to their classroom. And they were like furiously scouring Google for how to teach the day after a school shooting, how to teach the day after an election. And so as part of the research process, when I asked them in the spirit of reciprocity, what are some resources, how can I support you? And they said, can you create a Facebook group? This was back in 2017. I said, sure, for those 30 people. They were also old like me. And so we created the group, and then it grew and grew. In the summer of 2020, someone shared it on social media, and it grew to 2,000 people. I thought that was a lot. I'm a professor. I don't want to run a Facebook group. Like, I have a job. This should not be my job. But then, on January 6th, someone shared it on TikTok. And we were very cool that day. And it grew to 16,000 people. And now it's up to 20,000. There's also a strangely large contingent of people from New Zealand. I don't know why. They're great. I don't know how they and so all that to say, I hate that this group has to exist. I hate that the book has to exist, that we have to be talking about this. But This is what teachers want. They need a place to talk about, to share resources, to dialogue about what they're doing or what they're questioning. And so, my students are trying to get me to do this on TikTok now. It's not going well. But if you would like to join us, here's how you can join us. The last thing that I want to share with you is that Dr. Hamza mentioned that I am currently a faculty member at UCONN. You know what tonight is. This is actually not my, that's actually not what I'm going to tell you. I just have to throw it in. Because they're helping me pay my BC student loans. Still. Before that, I just started there 2 months ago. Before that, I was a faculty member at Michigan State University. Go Green! For almost 10 years. And in February, there was a mass shooting at Michigan State's campus. And that was the first time that a major days after had hit so close to home for me. Because I didn't even know how to get out of my neighborhood with the GPS in Connecticut yet. East Lansing, Michigan was and still feels like home to me. And because of this work that the administration knew about, they brought me back to campus 3 days after the shooting to talk with students and to talk with faculty. And it was horrific. It was just as awful as you could imagine. But while I was there, I saw one of my former students. I might cry when I say this. In the book, between the chapters, there are student spotlights that are written by current high school or college, just badass young women and femmes, about what they remember or rather don't remember about days after. And one of those student spotlights is written by one of my former students named Marlena. Marlena lived through Sandy Hook. And she's now a senior at Michigan State. So she is 21, and she has just personally lived through her second school shooting. And when I found that out, when I found out just about Sandy Hook, I asked her, but you still want to be a teacher? How? How do you still want to be a teacher? So that's what the spotlight is about. But she said it's because in those moments, in the days after, she saw the power of teaching. And so I asked her a few weeks ago, Marlena, what about now? You're a senior, you're almost done with your program. How are you doing? What's going on? And she said, I'm doing okay. I'm just trying to help people who are going through this for the first time, which is devastating. And she said, of course I still want to be a teacher. Nothing has changed from when she was in first grade and decided that she wanted to still be a teacher. And so I want to share that with you. That's kind of it is a very depressing way to end. But I want to share it with you because, because it's very personal to me, but also because I think Marlena reminds us of the power of days after, because it not only supported her deeply in that moment, but it shaped her entire life after that. So, thank you. So, we have a little bit of time for questions or comments, anything that you would like to share or think through together. Yes.
So we were having a discussion just about, one of the things that came to my mind was just talking about teaching on days after, in particular when students and obviously hopefully my future classroom, right, don't belong or relate to a certain identity or demographic. So I was talking to her a little bit about how there's a very small Native American population here at BC or anywhere outside of a reservation. I grew up living next to a reservation, and Native American issues are very deeply important to me. And just talking about if not if, because they are important, but how we kind of like pick what days after are important. Like right now, there's a whole big thing with the Indian Child Protection Act happening, and just kind of like how those dialogues are important, how we can facilitate those in a classroom when, in particular, nobody belongs to that identity. Yeah, that was my question.
Thank you. That's a great question. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about what the teachers in the book said, because I'm so grateful to all of the teachers who shared their stories with me. And as a teacher educator, I think it's my job to center the voices of practicing teachers in today's classrooms. And so teachers expressed two categories of days after that they thought they really needed to talk about. One were things that directly impacted their students in their classroom, and others were exactly as you're talking about, that the students may not bring it up, but that you need to bring it up because they need to know about it. Because, for example, if teachers were teaching in a predominantly white school and no one was going to bring up something that impacted communities of color, yet you are teaching people who are going to be in categories of power because of their identity someday, the teachers knew that they had to talk about it. And so they were strategic in thinking about the ways in, right? So is a way in by reading a children's book if you're in an elementary classroom, right? To give them some of the background knowledge that they might need. Because we know it's not in textbooks, right? What you're talking, it's not going to be in textbooks. Or it's going to be sanitized, colonized, language. So is it through something that's happening in the news, and they can bring in the news articles, they can bring in children's books. But really what they said is that it was, in fact, it felt easier to do that, what you're asking, because they knew that their students weren't going to be as personally impacted. So even if they didn't know the content, right, they might not be as harmed or triggered or traumatized by the conversation. And so teachers were more willing to engage in that type of days after pedagogy than one where they were afraid of re-traumatizing their students. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, that answered the question. Thank you.
Thanks. Other questions? Sorry. Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah.
One thing that came up a lot with teachers was feeling like they didn't know enough about the situation, right? Like that they didn't have the expertise. This came up recently when I was talking with teachers about the war in Ukraine. And they said, well, the students are asking me about it, but I don't know the geopolitical situation in Ukraine. I don't know the history of Russia and Ukraine. And then I would talk to students and they'd be like, we don't care. We want to talk about what it's like when there's major news coverage of a war. And are we going to go to war? What does this mean for us in this country? So students on days after are not looking for academic levels of expertise. They're looking for our humanity. Over here and then back there.
I was just gonna say, so I'm literally in my second month of teaching.
Wow. Okay.
And I feel like something that I've been struggling with is because schools as institutions are so wrapped up in white supremacy and therefore silence.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I don't know how to communicate with especially my white colleagues and my white administrators, people who kind of are above me, because as a young teacher and also as a person of color, my perspective is very quickly discounted. And so I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on at an institutional level when you're facing not necessarily individual resistance, but more the culture of the school is resistant to opening up those conversations, and like how we can open up those conversations not only in our own classrooms but also encourage our colleagues to do the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard when you're brand new too, right? Because you don't know who your allies are, right? You don't know who they are yet. And so I think part of it is being strategic and figuring out who those allies are, right, over time. And you can tell that based on some simple things, right? Like what's on their walls, what's on their doors, how do students talk about them, how do students of color talk about them. And then I'd also say that there are ways that we can change the culture of the school by using outside of school resources, out of school resources. So connecting with local teacher activism groups. I know that in Boston there are some I-tags, and it's a little I and then a capital TAG, inquiry to action groups. And they're run by, some are run through the teachers union, but others are run through nonprofit teacher organizers. And every year they kind of have a focus of what their inquiry is going to be. So is the inquiry into policies that limit bilingual education and translanguaging? Is the inquiry into white supremacy in our schools? And then they support each other outside of school to then be strategic about the changes that are made inside school. Because I think so often we as teachers are told, okay, well go, you know what you need to do, go in your classroom and shut the door and just do what you need to do, right? That can only last for so long. That's really isolating. Teachers need a community. And so if you can't find those allies within the school, then you can hopefully find them out of the school and learn their strategies that they use to change their communities, and then find ways to apply it to your context, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to share some resources of teacher activist groups in the area if anyone would be interested in that. Yes?
Yeah, so I just have a question. I see several of us here who are in the Ed Leadership Program, and so I don't know how you guys are feeling, but I'm feeling concerned that it seems so common that leaders would not be supportive or speaking out in days after. And so I just wanted to solicit your thoughts and advice for us as we're working with aspiring leaders about the messages that we need to communicate to our students about how to be supportive of teachers as well as communities during these days after.
Thank you. Every single teacher that both answered that survey that I talked about, the 2016 one after the election, and every teacher that I talked to for this project, so that's probably a total of 1,200 teachers across demographic contexts, every single one said the one factor that they would need to confidently engage in days after pedagogy was a supportive administrator. Every single one, hands down. Now, some of them said that support is being explicit by saying you can do what you need to do. Others said that's not enough. I need the administrator to make a statement. I need them to be the one to talk to parents, to families, to make sure that they've got my back. Others said being explicit that I can talk about it and issuing a statement is not enough because it can't just be on those days, right? We need a mission and a vision that's tied to equity and justice. And then we can't just have that thing on the wall and on our website. We need to enact it every day so that it becomes part of the culture of our school. So one of the stories in the book is from an amazing music teacher. Any music educators here? Okay. From an amazing music teacher who's teaching in a New York City public school, who has I really didn't think that schools like this teacher described could exist. And it's my job to prepare teachers, so that's kind of depressing. But this school is amazing. They live out their vision for equity and justice every day. They have common planning time for teachers, which seems like a small thing, but is huge, right? They have student community time where students run the meeting and talk about what they want to talk about. They have collaborative planning time for student leaders and faculty, for students to help decide what the teachers teach. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And it's a public school. So we know that it can be done. And the reason that it's done in this place is because administrators are living out that vision in practice. Incidentally, after the January 6th insurrection, I wrote a little blog and it went viral on social media. And some people came to the Facebook group and found my work because their administrators shared it with them. And that was the first time that I really saw administrators in major public school districts, like in Dallas, in Atlanta, in Boston, sharing and saying, like, yes, you can and should talk about that. So I'm going to choose to remain hopeful that it's possible. Okay, yes, thank you so much.